The U.S. government system gives the localities, meaning the states and local community governments, a great deal of independence. Even though the federal government may have some overarching protections for its citizens, the local governments have autonomy and may not provide for the same level of protection. An example of states' discriminatory practices are the English as an official language laws and those policies that support it in some states. Think about how this practice and policy might affect people's education, their chances of getting employed, or their ability to be part of the social world. We take for granted the ability to access a free education. But education was not provided for all U.S. citizens early in our history. The states varied quite a bit in this regard, and it was not until the 1920s that all states provided a free education for all children. Thus, those with wealth had access, while those who were poor did not. The quality of education also varies with the ability of the school to access resources so that the children of wealthy parents can access a higher quality of education. Additionally, the standard school curriculum does not adequately cover non-white history, non-white literature, or minority culture as much as it does focus on white experience and historical figures. Some have called to rectify this situation with balancing out the mainstream culture with ethnic study programs to help educate children about non-white cultures and contributions to American history. Religious practices in our country were based on the large number of Protestants that settled in the New World. There was little tolerance for religious practices outside the Protestant norm, making it difficult for groups with their own religious identities to escape discrimination in the naming of national holidays, workplace holidays, and assumptions about religious practices. The spiritual practices of some African Americans and Native Americans are deeply rooted in non-Christian traditions, but are rarely recognized by mainstream American culture. Hate groups can also mobilize to intimidate and marginalize minority groups. While many people are familiar with the Ku Klux Klan due to their long history of intimidating blacks and Jewish peoples, there are other groups that intimidate minorities on the basis of their racial identity, as well as on the basis of religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and even disability. Hate groups exist across the entire U.S. One group that helps to identify these hate groups is the Southern Poverty Law Center, who identifies which groups are active and what those activities are. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a leading civil rights nonprofit group that monitors hate groups and exposes their activities to the public, to the media, and to law enforcement. There are several leading movements that have fought discrimination and prejudice on the basis of race in the United States. Many of us think about the Black Civil Rights Movement as something that occurred during the 1950s and the 1960s, because that is when the media gave it the most coverage. But this movement actually started way back during the slave era. It built inertia and energy leading into the 1950s and 60s, when the civil rights movement became a strong national concern. The main events that framed the civil rights movement was the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till in the 1950s, as well as the Montgomery bus boycott led by Rosa Parks, and the organizational genius and speaking ability of Martin Luther King. Most people are familiar with the civil rights movement, but there have been other efforts to dismantle discrimination in the United States. The Chicano civil rights movement has addressed education, voting rights, and the rights of agricultural workers. And while most people are familiar with the Brown versus Board of Education case that desegregated the Southern schools, very few people know that Brown was based on a 1940s case, Mendez versus Westminster out of Orange County, which is where Los Angeles is in California. Mendez versus Westminster ruled that the Orange County school systems could not segregate Latino children in the schools. The Chicano movement also helped Mexican Americans restore their land use rights and has worked to improve urban environments. A leader in this movement has been Cesar Chavez, who organized farm workers in the 1960s and the 1970s. The modern American Indian movement, often referred to as the acronym AIM, started in the 1960s and gained publicity when the movement occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco. Many of the protests and activities were initiated to increase awareness and to negotiate for reparations. The Yellow Power movement has focused on the exploitation of Asian American farm workers and a focus on creating ethnic studies programs at the universities. Some of the work of the Yellow Power movement has also focused on improving the lives of Asian Americans living in San Francisco's Chinatown, Manilatown, and Japantown, focusing on helping children and the elderly in these communities.